Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our last session before the keynote speech. My name is Abdullah Khalid Al Saud. I'm a visiting research fellow at the ICSR Center, and it is my privilege to chair this session. We'll be talking about national studies. We have a distinguished panel of speakers. We'll start with George Kassimeris. He's a professor of security studies from the School of Social, Historical and Political Studies, University of Wolverhampton. He'll be talking about the persistent failure to reconcile human rights and human security in counterterrorism, the case of Greece. So if you start with your presentation.
Thank you for the introduction. Hello, everyone. The first session post-lunch is notoriously painful for not the speaker, the audience. So thanks to the organizers for putting me on the spot. So I'll try and keep this as short, sweet, and to the point as possible. My presentation is on Greece, and because you've been fed on a primarily jihadi-related diet the last couple of days, some of you might welcome a slight change of focus and theme. So we're moving from, because there's more to life than jihadi-related violence and terrorism, I have to assure you. Greece is one example, and a very instructive one, actually. For those of you who think that Greece is just an exotic holiday destination, that's true, but it's also a place with a lot of problems, political and economic. I'm sure you know all about the economic problems, but there are a lot of political/ideological problems as well. And this is where my presentation on politically motivated violence will be centered upon. I'm going to start by using my favorite quote from an academic. He's a Basque academic, Joseba Julaita. And he said at some point, what can you do as a writer when your primary community, family, friends, or country produces terrorists? Zulaika is a Basque, and his country have been producing terrorists for a long time. I'm Greek, and my country is also a terrorist-producing country. And he goes on to say, do you define them? Do you diagnose them? Do you condemn them? Do you exercise them? Do you understand them? You do all these things, but exercise them. Because in Zulaika's case, in Spain's case that is, and in Greece's case also, exercising did not take those countries very far when it came to dealing with the problem head on. There was very little of understanding, very little of diagnosing them, a lot of condemnation, and much more exercising. And that's a lesson. Primarily, you need to understand what's going on the ground. And because if you don't try to understand what's going on the ground, because politically doesn't suit you or ideologically doesn't suit you, then you are in for the long haul, as has been the case both in Spain and Greece. This is not comparative analysis. Spain have resolved the problems because the nature of the problem as such is slightly different. Greece hasn't. Greece actually has a sustained problem of terrorism. Actually, the most sustained terrorist problem in Europe, if you move away from jihadist-related issues, which have been quite recent. To give you a bit of background info, because most of you don't know very much about it, nor would I expect you to, this is a permanent feature on Greece. Not a week goes by with a terrorist incident taking place, an attack on an embassy, or a police, counter-police violence, or anything that would result in a peaceful, democratic 21st century society. Also, for those who don't know, for background reasons, Greece experienced the notorious November 17th group, who in the room knows, apart from the obvious suspects, who is familiar with the notorious November 17th group? From the younger generation, I don't mean the people who lived in Greece or the people who are studying terrorism for a number of years. From the people who, you know, below 30, nobody. I thought so. You do. Yeah. You look 31, 32 to me. So you don't actually count. 27 years, ladies and gentlemen. 27 years, one of the longest and most ideologically polarized political campaigns of terrorism in Europe. In 27 years, there was not a single member that got arrested by the efforts of the Greek or American or Israeli or any security services. And I mention all these different security services because one way or another, at some point, they all got involved. 27 years is a long time, you know, operating as a terrorist group. And at some point, this was always going to come to an end, and it was always going to come to an end, at least in my estimation and analysis, not because of the impressive efforts of the Greek counterterrorism police, but because of a mistake on the part of the terrorists themselves, who got cocky, arrogant. They thought, you know, they could do nothing wrong, and they did. And the whole thing, which I don't have now the time or the space to explain, collapsed as a house of cards. So you would expect, okay, 27 years, we've been dealing with it in a very inadequate way. The cycle of violence and terrorism has come to an end, so we move on as a country and as a society. How little did you know? Before even the old group, withered, an emergence of new groups, a new generation of guerrillas came into the fore. And actually the violence, the revolutionary violence, because I'm talking primarily about anti-state, anti-establishment, left-wing violence, intensified. So that's why you've got the most sustained terrorist problem anywhere in Europe, with no sign, of this being resolved. Why? We'll come to this at a later stage, but I wanted to give you a little background of what's happening. So, one of the reasons this has been happening and will continue to happen is because there's this preconceived idea in the political and security elites in Athens that terrorists just come and go. Militants, in my opinion, do not come out of the blue. There's a reason when there's or a bombing or a rocket attack or a shooting takes place. Of course, it's much easier. It has been politically convenient for Greece's political elites to deal with it and label it as an aberration, as an unfortunate aberration, but it's not an aberration. It's a state of the affairs. Of course, you can disregard also the political culture and the economic conditions from which this stems, but you should do this at your peril. And if you go one step further and you treat terrorists as politicized criminals, and the violence is deviant and criminal, then you are in for a very long 30, 40 years now. And that's what's been happening, actually. The Greek state failed to realize who these people are and were, what they wanted, and how to deal with them. So if you don't know what these people want, how can you deal with them? If you think they are just a bunch of delinquents, low-life delinquents, then you're going to treat them accordingly. The country itself is a fascinating country, as some of you who have visited know. It's a country full of contradictions. It's a country with amazing weather. But it's also a country with a lot of confrontation. And that confrontation is ideological primarily. In the 70s, you had this, what you have now with ISIS. There was a lot of radicalism in Europe, Spain, France, Italy, lots of terrorist groups coming to the fore, causing a lot of trouble, in Germany as well. In the Greek case, this culture of dissent, disorder, and confrontation has prevailed, it has remained. And because in Greek political culture, opposition, violent, militant opposition, to the what is called and what is regarded as a responsive political system, the government, the state, is the key element. People, yesterday there was a major bust-up between militants and police in the center of Athens. There's always a good opportunity for people to actually display and express their resentment, their anger, and the frustration against that system and the representatives of that system. The Greek police is a major target here, is a major problem for why this has been going on. We'll come to this in a sec. Now, do people choose to commit politically motivated violence without discourse? I don't think so. And of course, to get away from the cliches, of course they are made and they are not born. But there's a belief in the utility and the necessity of violence in Greece and in places like Greece because there's a systemic collective body of grievances. And I put some of them down, which is abuse of authority, political corruption, police brutality. And you would agree with me that these are legitimate reasons, legitimate grievances. These people, when they take arms up, they do this because of all these reasons. And police brutality is again a main issue which ties to the human security and human rights element of this conference. I spent 3.5 years of my life trying to get to the bottom of this. And the only way, in my opinion, that you get to the bottom of this is by talking to these people. Of course, they will have romantic notions of their activity and their actions. Of course, they will try to beautify their... So I spent 3.5 years trying to talk to them. And I spoke to some of them. Most of them are in prison. And living under very difficult circumstances and conditions. And these are a couple of quotations. Somebody like me once said, does what he does because he believes it is morally necessary and the right thing to do. The key question here is, what does one reach that point? And why does one reach that point indeed, actually? And the second one is, I have lived in times when I felt the injustice all around me, when I felt that human life did not count for much. This is something that makes you want to put a stop to injustices, and this is what makes you want to take up arms, using one form of injustice in order to stop another. And this is the interesting bit here, you see. They are not oblivious to the fact that what they are doing is politically and ethically and morally acceptable. They do realize that is an injustice. And what they, in their worldview, using one injustice to stop another is the only way available to them, or at least that's what they think. Now, for a phenomenon like this to prevail for so long, there've got to be some concrete, solid elements. Commitment is one of them. For a political campaign of violence to last 30, 40 years and still have attract new recruits, there's got to be commitment. And the people I've spoken to, the Greek politically motivated actors of violence, are very committed. They're very romantic, they're very fanatical, but also very committed. Because as Marangella said in his mini manual, they feel they have this moral superiority in doing that. And this is what sustains them, year after year, decade after decade, despite the setbacks and the problems. And the Greek experience confirms that. What Marangella didn't talk about in his mini manual was about the vindictiveness of the state when the state deals or tries to deal with a problem. And there's a lot, I'm sorry to say, there's a lot of vindictiveness on the part of the Greek state dealing with them. I don't know if it's a complex reading situation after all the flack and all the stick they've been receiving for decades for not being able to deal with the problem, because it is a bit of a problem, having a terrorist group cruising in Athens through, doing different operations, attacking the American embassy and killing people and bombing people and sending rockets on the broad daylight. But the Greek state, ever since it got lucky, it got a break with the November 17th terrorists, of which the vindictiveness is the main characteristic. And it gives me great regret to actually say that. An underground corridor of 16 square meters with a metallic box for a yard and sky-high walls and barbed wire. A modern systematic torture chamber that aims to physically and mentally destroy us. This is a description of Athens' main high security prison. Obviously there's a specially made prison unit there for all type of terrorists, not only the November 17th, which, as far as they're concerned, it has the personality and the consciousness. Now, would that be an exaggeration coming from a terrorist? Perhaps it would be, but I can tell you, I've spoken to some of them for a great length of time, and they are destroyed individuals, totally mentally and emotionally destroyed. And the reason why they're destroyed is because they are being asked and forced to live under very harsh conditions. Now, I'm not a human rights activist, I've been talking to all sorts of people. I was talking to, counterterrorism officials, militants, everybody. I try to keep a balanced way of approaching this. But I can tell you from first hand, these people are mentally and emotionally destroyed. And the reason why they're mentally and destroyed and physically destroyed is because of the Greek state's vindictiveness and refusal to deal with them as human beings. The state's role, after he has actually dealt a blow on an enemy such a terrorist, is to try and reintegrate or re-educate that person, not actually destroy them. But this is what has been happening. And it's an indictment on Greek political approach to this. Like I said, I'm not a human rights activist. Savas Xiros is one of the main protagonists of this. He's a guy who, years ago, the operation went wrong, the bomb exploded in his face, and this is where the house of cards collapsed from him. Obviously, after such a situation, he was blind in one eye, limited vision in another, asthma, you can read it all there. And that was at the beginning, and that was 15 years ago. As things progressed and time went on, his health problems deteriorated, and the Greek state refused to deal with this in a humane, human rights way. The European Court of Human Rights has condemned Greece on regular basis to do something about this, but the Greek government, of all persuasions and of all colors, because there's been quite a few since then, have steadfastly refused to make any concessions. Now, this guy is a wreck. He's a total and utter wreck. Of course, he's a killer. He's killed people. He's a murderer. But there comes to a point where the state should use its humanitarian instincts and set an example. It hasn't. And what actually has this done, and I want to wrap this up, is this type of treatment has a radicalizing effect. It acts as a recruitment. Because if it's not this guy with his health problems, is the guy who has refused visitation rights to attend the birth of his son inside prison from his wife, who's also a militant, and they're having the baby inside prison, and the Greek state refuses visitation rights. So what does the guy do? He gets on a hunger strike. And what does the hunger strike do? Sends certain messages the outside in the armed struggle movement in Athens, radicalizing people in the process. And if it's not that, it's the beatings the militants receive while in custody. And these are not, instances that have come up selectively. They're all out in the open. There are photos. This time and age, you can't, after Abu Ghraib, you cannot really get away with that kind of behavior. And the reason why I want to give this paper, taking it from a human rights angle, is because these type of responses actually create more problems than they actually solve, and destroy the very democratic culture of which terrorists seek to destroy. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this fascinating speech. Next up is Thomas Renard. He's a senior research fellow, Egmont Royal Institute for International Relations in Brussels. He's going to talk about extreme measures against extremism, a view from Belgium.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me here. The starting point, the background of my presentation is the Belgium bashing, really, that has followed the attacks in Paris first and then in Brussels in November last year and March earlier this year, whereby Belgium has been called a jihadi rear base of Europe, the gun shop of Europe. It's been called a failed state. It's been called by a certain president-elect a hellhole. So plenty of things have been said. And of course, this has required intensive public diplomacy efforts from Belgium to reassure the population, to reassure potential tourists, to reassure Belgium's partners in counterterrorism, obviously, and also to some extent, I don't think this was the main objective, but to some extent, at the very least, offering a counter-narrative so that it would deter potential terrorists to come to this paradise of jihad as it was portrayed by some. And obviously, the authorities in these public diplomacy efforts were helped and supported by also the famous sense of humor of Belgians. And so there have been a number of campaigns by citizens, by companies presenting Belgium in another light. And so, for instance, after Trump called Belgium a hellhole and an awful city, it's Belgium as a city, Brussels Airlines had a whole campaign saying, we fly you to Belgium, the city, but also to great other states such as Milan, Barcelona, and so on and so on. So plenty of things like that happened. But the main problem, in my view, with Belgium bashing is that many of this criticism, some of them were completely wrong. Many of them were just exaggerated with real underlying problems. But the way they were framed, and because they were so exaggerated, they occupied all the space available for debate and criticism. And that didn't really leave any space for a constructive, nuanced debate about these issues. It was too easy for the authorities, political, the various institutions dealing with this, to sort of dodge this criticism because they were framed in such extreme way. And so I think I wanted to, in this presentation, I wanted to come back to some of these criticism and address them perhaps in a slightly more nuanced manner to see what really is going on. And the first of this criticism is really what went wrong. I mean, is there really a problem with the Belgian response to terrorism and radicalism? And after all, it is well known, Belgium has the highest ratio of foreign terrorist fighters per capita in the European Union. We have a significant problem with radicalization. There is, in addition to the foreign terrorist fighters, there is a significant number of radicalized individuals, and we have many other sins. And that raises two sub-questions, if you will. One is how did we get there? So how did we get to so many foreign terrorist fighters and radicalized individuals? So it's all about sort of the prevention aspect, and it's been kind of mentioned in the previous panel, the fact that that Belgium may have lacked a good, clear prevention policy before 2010, and it's partly true. This whole question of how did we get there, I think when I look into it, and I don't want to spend too much time because I think this has been addressed in previous conferences of the Trans series, and my colleague Rick Koos had certainly addressed that. When I look at it in Belgium, I find a lot of explanations, but all of them are unsatisfying in the sense that I don't really see none of these explanations, and even all these explanations put together don't really explain why this phenomenon happened in Belgium to the extent, or to a great extent, than it happened in other countries. I mean, we can talk about marginalized neighborhood, we can talk about Molenbeek, we can talk about various inequalities, we can talk about inefficient police or policing, we can talk about a permissive environment, we can talk about all of that, but I can always think of other examples across Europe. So I find it really hard to pinpoint what really went wrong in Belgium. But perhaps more interesting to me in this case and in the context of this presentation is to raise the question whether Belgium is actually, in a way, too small to succeed. It's kind of, you could call that the Smurfs dilemma, if you want. Because as it is quite well known that we have the highest ratio of foreign terrorist fighters per capita, it is less known. I think this is not something we scream everywhere. We may have one of the, if not the lowest rate of investment in terms of resources and personnel in our security services per capita or per foreign terrorist fighters. We have we spend 3 times less in our security services than our neighbors, similar neighbors, Netherlands, Denmark, Sweden. We have much less personnel. We have overall less means. And if you go back to the keynote presentation of yesterday, it was said that security services operate within legal constraints, but actually security services have 2 main constraints. One is the legal one, but the other one is the operational constraint. And I think in Belgium, the operational constraint is much more significant than the legal constraint, which is quite comparable to the constraint of neighboring countries. So there is really something there that is an issue. And if you look back over the past few years, whereas the threat has increased, some would say snowballed, really, the means available to the security services has remained stable, or actually in real terms decreased potentially, because the workload increased so much. More people to watch. Now with the broadening of the watch list to the homegrown people, it puts much more pressure on all of these services that don't have more time, more means. They can't take a holiday. They're working 24/7 almost. So it's a real pressure on these services, and it has become a real problem for a country like Belgium. Having said this, of course the Smurfs always win in the end, even though they're facing the big Gargamel. So having said this, the government has announced over the past year a number of measures to partly fix this, to address this issue, this problem. So more financial means, more personnel for police, for intelligence services at the local level. A whole number. I mean, plenty of things are happening or have been happening over the past few years. But obviously, there is always the time factor, and so it always takes a lot of time for these measures to kick, to have an impact, for these people to be hired, to be trained, and to be able, and basically it always then leads to the question of whether we are creating tomorrow's or today's response to yesterday's problem, and also whether we are creating such an architecture that will no longer be fit to the threat that is itself evolving and morphing so quickly. So that is a key challenge, obviously. We should also keep in mind that this far there is little, if any, evidence that terrorist groups or individuals have come to Belgium based on the assumption that it is a weak country where they could have some kind of a safe harbor. I think I need to refer here to my colleague Rick Koosheid, who says all radicalization is local. It has been said here as well. And I think Belgium has its own problem. We have a problem because perhaps our policies were not as good as they should have been, or means were not what they should be, but it's not something that we have imported because of what we are. In spite of the problem of radicalization, we should also remember that Belgium has had a significant number of counterterrorism successes. Think of Verviers in January 2015. And there's been plenty. Think of the Brussels lockdown. You guys will remember Brussels lockdown. This is, I mean, everyone talked about it as sort of a, we're locking down the city and nothing is happening. But actually, that was the whole point. Nothing happened. So it may be exaggerated, but as a response. But it seems, looking backwards, that it may be a better alternative than what could have happened. And obviously Belgium has had its own counterterrorism failure as well, unfortunately similarly to other countries in Europe. But in spite of all that, I would say, and I would frame it in a way that the problem is not so much about the means in absolute term, but it's about, and this has been said before today as well, this is not so much about the absolute means you have and deploy, but it's about the allocation of resources and the identification of priorities. And I think that's really much more important at this stage. And that brings me to the second criticism that has been addressed to Belgium, which is basically, is Belgium institutionally designed to fail? I mean, institutional complexity in Belgium is quite famous, and it has been pointed out as a factor hindering an effective and coherent response to terrorism and radicalism. Belgium is the country of surrealism, and in many aspects our institutions are surreal. It is true. But when it comes down to counterterrorism and counter-radicalization, the division of competences is actually quite clear. If you look at the various, at the constitution and the various laws that divide the competences between the different layers, this division is actually quite clear. But the problem is, as always, in the implementation, devil being in the details. That's when, particularly when you have an overlap of competences, for instance, prevention policies is in the hands of all the different layers of government. So basically the federal government, the regions, the communities, the municipalities, they all have some kind of responsibility and competence in the field of prevention. And so that creates a certain number of tensions on the ground. There's also another issue with the fact that Belgium is not just a federal state, but it's a state in the process of federalization. So there is a continuous transfer of competences from the federal state to the federal entities, the federated entities, the regions, the communities. And the latest state reform happened 2 years ago. And so basically the competence of security, some of the competence related to prevention and security were transferred from the federal to the regions. And so basically that means that it's only very recent that so for instance, a strategy against a strategy for the prevention of radicalization has been developed by the Brussels region last year. You would think it's a little bit late, but that's only because they got the competence last year. So this is also something, unfortunately, that we have to bear in mind. The other particularity of the Belgian system is that there is no hierarchy between the different layers of competence. And this is really something that distinguishes Belgium from other federal states, whereas normally you would have the federal level and then the federated entities that are somehow subsumed to the federal level. But in Belgium, it's not the case. Everyone is on the same level. So the federal government cannot give injunctions, orders to the federated entities, and therefore that requires much more coordination between the different actors, and as a result, a lot depends on the goodwill of these various actors and entities to develop programs, initiatives related to counterterrorism, radicalization, and so, for instance, one of the communities in Belgium is only starting to develop its own, not de-radicalization, but individual follow-up with individuals in the process of radicalization. They're setting up a new unit there, but this is something that they're just starting. And also, for instance, the federal government, the Minister of Interior, had this idea or this proposition to create at the local level what they call local cells for integral security, where basically all the local actors sit together. So the mayor, the head of police, people from social workers, people from the social services, from teaching and so on, they sit together and they discuss potential problematic cases and what to do about them. Great idea. The thing is, they can't impose anything. So what they do is they offer a model, and then it's down up to the municipalities to decide whether they want to do it or not. And so what we have seen in Belgium is a number of municipalities develop this particular type of format and other prevention policies when actually they have no real case or no real problem related to radicalization, and other municipalities that are really confronting with a problem that have not developed this kind of format, this kind of policies. So this lack of coherence may be related to the fact that in Belgium we don't have a counterterrorism strategy. And again, going back to, I think, to the keynote of yesterday, I think it was really emphasized how important a strategy can be, not as a document, but really as a process whereby everyone comes together, sit together, to get to the same page, as it was said yesterday, and to share a certain amount of objectives, priorities, to make sure that we all go in the same direction. So because we don't have that, for instance, there is no clear policy with regard to de-radicalization, for instance. So do we in Belgium want to do de-radicalization? Do we want to do that or not? And I hear some municipalities want to do it and doing it. Others don't want and not doing it. At the federal government, some people believe in it, some people don't believe in it. So there is no clear vision on these kind of things, and that, in my view, is problematic. Having said this, the system, the Belgian institutional complex, may not be the most efficient, but I haven't identified yet a case of counterterrorism failure that can be attributed to this institutional complexity. So it is certainly a hindrance, but it's not directly related to major counterterrorism failure, if that is any comfort. And even if the system itself is not perfect, there are a number of coordination mechanisms that are in place. And for instance, we have a plan against radicalism. It's called the Plan R, created in 2005, updated last year. And in that plan, there are a lot of institutional mechanisms that are meant to facilitate coordination between all the different security and non-security actors. So in terms of prevention, social prevention, heart prevention, all of them, and it's very complex models, so I won't bother you with that, but the mechanisms are there. It's just that, as always, in practice, it only works to some extent. But having said this, we should also bear in mind that coordination everywhere is usually a problem, even in centralized, highly centralized country. Even in France, we know that there are a number of problems with coordination of the counterterrorism policy. So to conclude, Belgium has a long counterterrorism experience and expertise. It was among the first countries in Europe to identify the problem and to react to it. In many ways, Belgium was really quick to respond and address this issue, and partly in good ways, but the response was mainly reactive and focused on security or hard repression aspects. And that's where the means are most limited, whereas new prevention tools to prevent the threat from growing are still in the development phase now, and they're just not yet bearing their full potential, while the institutional landscape appears as a complicating factor, though not an insurmountable one. And there are obviously mechanisms there to mitigate the risk. So this is the end of my presentation, but I look forward to exchanging to your thoughts and criticism.
Thank you very much for this informative presentation. Lastly, we have Simon Cottee. He's a senior lecturer in criminology, School of Social Policy, Sociology and Social Research at the University of Kent. He's going to talk about jihadists of the Caribbean.
Okay, good afternoon. I want to start with a striking and in many respects perplexing statistic. It's estimated that between 89 and 125 Trinidadians, or Trinis to use the standard local idiom, have joined ISIS. This places Trinidad with a population of 1.3 million, including around 100,000 Muslims, top of the list of Western countries with the highest rates of foreign fighter radicalization. This is from a quote from a recent paper in Studies in Conflict and Terrorism on Violent Extremism in Trinidad and Tobago. If the high end of the estimate, 125, is accurate, this would equate into a rate of 96 individuals per million, a rate that is roughly double that of Belgium, which, according to data collected from the International Center for the Study of Radicalization, it's a nice name check there, experiences the highest per capita rate of foreign fighters in the Western world. This is one of the big neglected stories of the war in Syria, and it's why I returned to Trinidad in February and June this year. I say return because I used to live in Trinidad, where I lectured at the University of the West Indies. This is from issue 15 of Dabiq, ISIS's online magazine, published in July this year, on the 31st of July this year. The person standing here looking rather angelic and studious is identified as Abu Saud at Trinidadi. Referring to his conversion to Islam from Christianity, he told the magazine that he was, quote, around 20 when he came to accept the religion of truth, Islam. Asked if he had a message for the Muslims of Trinidad, at Trinidad he said, "Fear Allah and return to the religion." At Trinidadi's real name is Shane Crawford, a 31-year-old from Enterprise in central Trinidad. This is Crawford in a video posted to YouTube in June 2014, trying on a different look.
Be seriously doubt this guy got video.
Crawford, who left for Syria in December 2013, is well known to law enforcement in Trinidad. In 2011, when the government declared a state of emergency, he was held with 16 others on suspicion of plotting to assassinate the then Prime Minister, Kamla Persad Bissessar. But the police didn't have enough evidence to mount a case, and he was released after two weeks in custody. The last state of emergency in Trinidad was declared in 1990 when, on July 27, a group of black Muslims, the Jamaat al-Muslimin, stormed into the nation's parliament and tried to take down the government. At 6:30 p.m., the Muslimin's leader, Yazin Abu Bakr came on television, and this is what he had to say to the nation.
At 6 p.m. this afternoon, the government of Trinidad and Tobago was overthrown. The Prime Minister and members of the cabinet are under arrest. We are asking everybody to remain calm. The revolutionary forces are commanded to control the streets.
This was premature. 6 days later, the Muslimin surrendered and the government regained control. In his The Beak interview, Crawford references this cataclysm in Trinidad's recent history, alluding to a faction of Muslims in Trinidad who, quote, attempted to overthrow the disbelieving government but quickly surrendered and participated in the religion of democracy, demonstrating that they weren't upon the correct methodology of jihad. In Trinidad, the Muslimin is widely denounced and to some extent feared as a militant group. Yet it's instructive that Crawford condemns it for not being militant enough and for not practicing the right kind of Islam. As part of my fieldwork in Trinidad, I interviewed law enforcement agents, politicians, community leaders, imams, Islamic activists, journalists, and the families and friends of migrants to Islamic State. Let me give you a brief summary of some of my findings. In Trinidad, the Islamic scene is divided. There is the Indo-Islam of the East Indians, who first came to Trinidad in the mid-19th century as indentured slaves. And there is the Black African Islam of the Muslimin. There's also a third group, the radical breakaway factions from the Muslimin, and it's from these factions that ISIS is drawing a steady flow of recruits. According to Darius Figuera, a Trinidad-based criminologist, these factions are Salafi-influenced and exist in tension with both the Muslimin and the Islam of the East Indians. If you have any understanding of the Jamaat al-Muslimin, Figuera said, you'll understand that Islamic State will have nothing to do with them because the Muslimin does not pass the test by Islamic State to be a Salafi jihadi organization. You have those in Trinidad who pass, he elaborated, but you won't find them down there among the Muslimin. You'd find them in central Trinidad. And this, Figuera immediately added, is the byproduct of years of work done by the House of Saud financing a program of indoctrination into Wahhabi Islam in Trinidad and Tobago. Figuera had a lot to say about this, although I can't repeat it here. On the issue of numbers, this is disputed. The official number of Trinis who have left for ISIS-controlled territory in Syria is 120, but it's likely that the true figure is much higher than this. Rudol Munalal, an opposition member of parliament in Trinidad, claims, based on a secret leaked police report that he acquired, that it's more in the range of 400. I spoke with a well-placed security source in Trinidad who confirmed this. This source also claimed that some leavers had received military training in Trinidad before they left. There is Mujahideen training, or there has been Mujahideen training going on in TNT since about 2007, he said. These are screenshots from a video that was allegedly filmed in South Trinidad in 2014 and that drew national headlines in Trinidad in 2015. This man is believed now to be in Syria. The issue of recruitment is also deeply contested. Nobody really knows how it's happening and whether it's top down or bottom up, to use Mark Sageman's terminology. What is not disputed is the where of recruitment. Mark Besson, a TV journalist in Trinidad, told me that in May 2014, the hub of recruitment was in Rio Claro, shifting in 2015 to Diego Martin. Rio Claro, as you can see here from this map of Trinidad, is in the southeast. and Diego Martin is in the northwest, just above the capital city of Port of Spain. You can also see how close Trinidad is to mainland South America, just 6 miles from Venezuela. Rio Claro also crops up in a leaked secret police report on 102 Trinis who are believed to have gone to Syria, including 30 women and 40 children. Of the 32 men on the list, most are Afro-Trinidadian descent, and their ages are between 30 and 50. The women, also largely of Afro-Trinidadian descent, are between 30 and 40, and the children are from 2 years to 16 years. The vast majority are listed as from the Rio Claro area. On the 2 occasions when I was in Trinidad earlier this year, I tried to meet Yazin Abu Bakr, but he was unable to see me. However, I did meet his 31-year-old son, Fuad, who showed me around the Muslimin compound on the outskirts of Port of Spain. Fuad has taken on the family business, so to speak. Listen, he said, there are facilitators, people who are there in Syria. They communicate to friends. Trinidad is small and the Muslim community is even smaller. So it's basically friends, people you know who are saying to you, do you want to come? No big bad recruiter. Yet this is not quite the picture I received from one anonymous source within the Ministry of National Security, who identified an imam of a mosque in Rio Claro as a major ISIS recruiter. In 2015, 5 members of this imam's family, including his daughter and 3 teenage grandchildren, traveled to ISIS-controlled territory in Syria. It's also known that Shane Crawford, aka at Trinidadi, used to pray at his mosque. I want to end by saying something about the why question. Why is Trinidad such a prolific exporter of foreign fighters to Syria? This is a difficult question to answer, especially in the space of just a few minutes. A big part of the answer lies in the government's inaction or permissiveness on this issue. Government of Trinidad and Tobago has known about migrations to Syria for a long time, but has done little or nothing to stop them. In fact, this was state policy at the start of the conflict in Syria, and it remains state policy today. As Rudal Munilal flatly explained to me, ISIS is not prescribed in TNT, Trinidad and Tobago, meaning that you can go and train with ISIS for 2 to 3 years and come back here with all the rights and privileges of a citizen of Trinidad and Tobago. There's a lot more I could say about this issue, but I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. So we'll start our question session. I think George, the gentleman who wanted to ask had to leave, so yeah, so I'll take his place and start off by asking you a quick question. You mentioned there are the grievances that serve as preconditions for the radicalization of terrorists, but these grievances are collective, shared by a majority of, I guess, if I understood you correctly,
majority
of community.
No, really, no. I mean, this is always a minority issue.
Yeah.
Terrorism has never been a majority issue, because if it was a majority issue, then we would be having a different conversation in a different.
But I mean, they are shared by lots of individuals who not necessarily take up arms. So, from the Greek context, are there specific reasons that make certain people take up arms or decide to resort to violence and others not, even though they share the same grievances?
That's a very good question, because if every single person who had ideological or political disagreement with the government or with another group took up arms, the problem would have been considerably more widespread. But there is a difference. There's a level at which certain people are tipped, fall over the edge, and it's the type of radicalization they experience. There are people, when you talk to them, who say, I was leading a very, I was politically motivated, I had political interest, I went to demonstrations, I had heated political discussions with my friends and other people, but I never envisaged going into, in using violence, using arms. And then something happens. Usually it's a close friend of theirs or a member of the family who gets hurt in a demonstration, in a police cell, and that tips them over. People have this impression that, or some people have this impression that, these people are complex individuals with very complicated lifestyles and priorities. They are not. They are as straightforward as we are, and they respond to hardship or emotional polarization in the same way that we would. But some of them find themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time with something really nasty happening to them. And the majority of people I've spoken to, police brutality keeps coming up. And if it's not police brutality outside the parameters of a police station or a prison, it's inside. And this is what the people that I mentioned as examples are all these people who have friends, have family, have relatives. The person who was refused visitation rights during the birth of his son, they got away from prison. He got rearrested in the center of Athens, in the summer, in a very Hollywood-style circumstance, with a lot of shooting going on, a lot of tourists getting injured. His wife got away, and she's at large. And it was only 6 months ago that she organized a helicopter escape unsuccessful, I hasten to add, from the high security prison to free him. That gives you the idea of the lengths these people would go if they feel, aggrieved. Because it's not only about going against the state, going against the establishment, it's about going against the people who have wronged you or, provoked or hurt you.
Thank you very much. This is very interesting because it's also similar to situation in Saudi. Quite a large number of those who travel to Syria are relatives of imprisoned or detained individuals who have been arrested after the 2003-2005 terror campaign inside the kingdom. So it's about the perceived injustice, even though if it's...
the perceived or the actual injustice.
Or the actual, exactly. This is what I mean.
This is applicable to all different terrorism theaters. It's not only about Greece or Belgium, it's about jihadis, it's about revolutionary leftists, it's about anarchists, it's about everybody. I mean, if you talk, I wanted to ask Andrew during your presentation, but Charlie did not allow enough time for the rest of us to to give the questions. It's about how the police, what kind of lessons the police have learned through the community interaction with the communities. And it's not about terrorism, because you use the classic Serrian Blair quotation, as about rioting, for example. The reason why rioting in 2011, the country was rioting from London all the way up to the north for 3-4 days, was because there was a major dysfunctionality between communities and the police. And this is there's no Greece where rioting takes place on a weekly basis and is a permanent feature of society. This is an advanced 21st century modern society. So we'll discuss this later, I hope, because it's a different. But it's about perception. It's about grievances. It's about people getting,
to the tipping point.
Yeah.
Thank you. So when you open the floor for questions, we'll take 3 questions and then we'll have the answer too. Yes.
Hi. Further to what was just said about local grievances, this question is specifically for Thomas. I wonder if you could comment on what you think the context is inside Belgium specifically that leads to these sorts of grievances, that produces the terrorists in the first place, and what makes the Belgian context different from other European states, aside from the situation in Greece. any comment would be appreciated.
Thank you. Yeah, gentleman next.
Three quick questions for everyone. Firstly, on Greece, as a frontline state in more ways than one, is Greece getting sufficient help from other countries? Because you can't just say, because things happen in Greece, that Greece has to deal with this. It's not like that. We've seen that dramatically with the immigration issues. Secondly, in relation to Belgium, and noting that the Kalashnikovs did not, or at least some of them, did not come from Belgium, and the Germans have got a lot of questions to answer about that. Given Belgium's geographical circumstances with non-natural borders very close, again, are the Belgian authorities getting sufficient proactive help from other European countries and beyond, particularly countries with particular signals intelligence capabilities? And thirdly, in relation to Trinidad and to Tobago, would you like to comment on the suggestion that you've identified what could be a very major institutional failing? What is known about the travel routings of these jihadists, including deceptive travel routings, and have these been identified and interdiction measures taken place? If not, why not? Because I would have thought that this might not be that difficult to do, but obviously it requires, again, cooperation. And I think I'd be asking serious questions in Trinidad and also elsewhere. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll get the answers to these questions and I'll be back to you. So, anyone?
Yes, the Greeks have been getting a lot of help when it comes to jihadist-related terrorism, when the jihadists use Greece as a route to mainland Europe, to places, hospitable cities like Belgium. And you have to get the joke, but you didn't. But anyway, let's move on. But when it comes to domestic terrorism, it's a domestic issue. I mean, they were receiving in the previous decades a lot of help from the Americans, and it got them nowhere because the moment you ask help from a non-national agency or country, then there's a lot of bureaucratic issues, jealousies, competitions. I mean, there is intra-bureaucratic jealousies to start with. Imagine now when you get the Americans, for example, in, and it becomes very counterproductive because they come in with different agendas and different methods and different approaches. And so, in terms of the Greek terrorist domestic problem, it never worked. But we do get help as Greeks with regards to the, Greece becoming a transnational, route to.
They'll help you if it helps them.
Exactly. I mean, let's be realistic and pragmatic about things. Why would you help Greeks to deal with issues which doesn't automatically affect you operationally?
Not automatically.
It will come back to haunt them, of course, but that will be another theme for another conference, I guess. So I hope I've answered your question.
Belgium does actually get a lot of help from a number of countries.
Without having to ask?
It used to have to ask more than it does now. But the scope of cooperation with a country like France is tremendous. I think the cooperation between Belgium and France has not a lot of equivalent in Europe. Perhaps the UK with some other European countries, but the cooperation, the extent of cooperation. You have to realize that the federal prosecutor probably calls with his French counterpart, has his French counterpart on the phone perhaps twice a day. This is the scope of cooperation. Between Belgium and France, there has been 30 joint investigation teams over the past 3 years, I think. Not all of them related to terrorism, but many of them related to terrorism. Other countries, obviously Belgium cooperates with the Dutch, with the Germans. Cooperation also is there with Morocco for obvious reasons of the large Moroccan community we have in Belgium. With Turkey, it's kind of a, I describe it usually as cyclical cooperation, so it has its ups and downs. But we have to, and so there's a number of mechanisms in place there. But when you mentioned specifically signal intelligence, I think it makes sense because, going back to what I was saying, Belgium has limited operational means. And for instance, signal intelligence, one of these where we are even more limited. But for instance, also social media intelligence is something where we have very limited capacities. Belgium has a long tradition of human intelligence, but the problem is, as you guys are all familiar with, there's a lot happening on the internet, and the problem is that requires specific skills, specific people, and if you're not able to recruit massively in over the past few years, then you don't have all these people, all the skills to deal with that, and for that you need cooperation with other countries. The US, the UK has been helpful in some aspects. So for instance, the man with the hat, Mohamed Abrini, it required US intervention to crack the phone and get the information. We also, when it comes to, you guys are perhaps familiar with the French guy, Rachid Kassim, the guy from Syria, sending sort of orders, operations in France, but apparently he may have had an impact in Belgium as well. At least one plot or related plot has been has been foiled in Belgium. Something that was spotted on Telegram. Now, I think, obviously, I'm not in the secrets of God. I don't know how far the Belgian services can go on Telegram and can do the kind of decryption and this kind of things. My intuition is, or capacities are quite limited, so my intuition is we receive also help for those specific aspects as well. On the specific grievances in Belgium, obviously there are plenty of grievances in Belgium like anywhere else, inequalities. Perhaps the most specific thing that distinguishes Belgium from neighboring countries is we have mostly a Moroccan community, whereas France is Algerian community, in Germany it's a Turkish community. And so, interestingly, in Belgium, there has been very few, if any, cases of a Turkish origin person joining ISIS in Syria or being involved in a plot against Belgium. So it's essentially Moroccans, a lot of them third generation, which is also a difference with France, for instance, which is exclusively second generation. So we have third generation people. A few Congolese, but really mostly Moroccan third generation Belgian citizens, Moroccan origin Belgian citizens. And then the question is why? It's like, why that specific community more than the Congolese or the Turkish? Because statistically they are subject to the same kind of discrimination, inequalities. They all stay in the same neighborhood, so you have these Moroccan ghettos, Turkish ghettos, Congolese ghettos, all across Brussels and Antwerp and other places. Why the Moroccan communities specifically? An explanation which is kind of paradoxical seems to be that whereas the Congolese community and the Turkish community is not really trying to assimilate, they don't try to integrate. They stay there. They have their own internal dynamic with their own cohesion, their own internal social promotion. The Moroccan community is much more scattered, and socially speaking, not geographically. And they have actually tried much more to integrate, to assimilate, but has failed to a large extent. Not probably the fault of the Belgian policies, not their fault, but the result is, it seems to me that in the case of Belgium, the radicalization of the Moroccan community seems to be the result of too much integration, but failed integration rather than not enough integration of these communities, which is a perplexing conclusion, I would say. But this seems to be the case.
Thank you. Simon?
Yeah, in terms on the question of travel from Trinidad to Syria, that there are multiple routes. One of the big routes early on in the conflict in 2013-14 was Venezuela, and also Suriname comes up, even Tobago to London, and
The question of UK authorities,
yeah.
so they're looking for this instead of drugs.
Yeah, and in 2013, about 25 Trinis were captured in Venezuela, including around 5 imams with 100 grand in US dollars and 50 passports. And yeah, this included women, children, and men.
So
And
from Venezuela, most likely routing would be possibly West Africa, but presumably into Madrid.
yeah, through Europe, yeah, and there are these rumors that Trinidadians have been receiving training in Venezuela with the support of the security services in Venezuela. Is it?
I think as the regime told us, you need to consider having a conference across the board in Venezuela because there are very deep issues there which still remain untouched.
Yeah. The Trinis who were captured in Venezuela have now been released. They've done their time.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We'll get another round of questions. Yeah.
I have a question for George. What you kind of talked about, which is people reacting to state torture. I would extend it a bit further and say that perhaps there is also a collapse of the imagination of the state, because there are a number of places where the states just do not protect. I mean, for example, look at the case of Myanmar versus the Rohingyas, and therefore. But here is also a catch-22. Which is no, and the catch-22 would be, where would a state kind of decide, or at which where do you use torture, how do you deal with these people? Because in a number of cases, if you look at projection of torture, there are a number of cases, and I work in South Asia, where there are a lot of people who are educated and involved in terrorist activities who have not been through either, state brutality, they've not been in jails, and they're educated, yet they're reacting to projection by the militant groups of what happens in, for lack of a better word, battlegrounds, jihadi battlegrounds. So then, they'll talk about, they'll show you films about torture of women and children and people, and excite you to participate in future terror activities. Now, how do you deal with that? Where does the state say, no more, enough is enough? Because this is where a state is not, it is complicit, but it's not complicit. It's a projection of its acts, its perception of its act by terrorist organizations, and projection in a way to capture more people.
It's a confusing question, I have to say, because where does the state stop, whether the state is complicit or not? These are gray areas, and you cannot really give a clear answer to that. My response to you would be that, first of all, the Smurfs always win. the second thing is, since the joke didn't go down very well, that, I'm trying to get out of this question because I don't know is the answer. The clear answer is I don't know, because different countries have different political cultures, different political parameters. There's history. I mean, when you talk to the people that I've interviewed, they've all said there is history for us to follow. Things that have happened in the past which have had a radicalizing effect to themselves or to the families. Also, it's a question of the quality of democracy. Greece, for example, if you want to talk about Greece, has a problematic democracy. There's a lot of corruption, there's misrepresentation, there's been a history of civil war, right-wing political oppressions. So where do you do? I mean, the police brutality, for example, is a remnant of the civil war era and the dictatorship that Greece has. And for example, Spain has the same problem. They went through civil war, they went through political dictatorship. Hence, you've got this kind of phenomena emerging. To try actually to get to the bottom of your question, in Greece, terrorism emerged after the country got out of its civil war and dictatorship period, in times of democracy. Because that type of democracy was deemed by the militants that it was a fake democracy, that the needs and the priorities of the people were not actually being addressed. Hence, there were people who actually decided to deal with it and try to respond to that. So it's not clear cut. And you use your own national case, of which I know very little, if next to nothing. You said that the government did not really provoke this kind of radicalization. How can this be true, for example? How can these people be radicalized with a few videos and a few pamphlets? Do you actually buy into that?
I didn't recognize you, Yorgos, sorry.
Me?
Yes,
you didn't recognize me?
No, I'm sorry. But so
after
nice,
all these years?
so nice to hear you talk. I don't know, I'm jet lagged. But I'd like both of you to speak a little bit. You had on your slide blocked institutions. And I remember living in Greece and reading the fire cells, or whoever they called themselves, their manifesto. And
a terrorist group, anyway, or the new generation.
The evolution of November 17th, or the new
generation of Greek.
And I remember reading the whole thing until they got to the point where they named Daniel, my husband, and all the other people as on their hit list. But I agreed with everything up to then.
Because it was your husband and you had enough of him.
No, up to then, and so, yeah. But
she was behind that, actually.
The grievances are real, and the corruption is real, and the things they were saying about who's in bed with who, it's just all true. And same thing, I wonder about Belgium, about the blocked institutional ways of dealing with grievances, because we have a really famous case in the States with Denny's, where a black man went in, and we've got a huge problem with discrimination against blacks in the U.S. We've got the Black Lives Matters movement that some people are now referring to as terrorists. I don't think that's the case, but the famous case is the guy goes in, orders a coffee, and they don't serve him. And I guess he's got witnesses, he wins $1 million. But what I heard over and over again in Belgium, if you're Moroccan and you're told go home Moroccan at a bar, or if you can't rent outside of Molenbeek, that it's very bureaucratic and there's no reward to winning. So I'm just curious to both of you, how could people solve these problems without resorting to violence? Like, well, what are the answers?
You can't resolve the problem, because there will always be people who will choose violence in order to advance their political beliefs. A lot of people disagree with other people, a lot of people feel underrepresented, a lot of people feel missed out, left out, but there's a special group of people who will choose violence to advance the political beliefs. And that will never change, in my opinion. The first thing I tell my...
But then why did you have that on your slide, blocked institutions? Because you're saying that's a problem. How could you unblock them?
They perceive the institutions as blocked. Some of the perception is right, some of the perception is wrong. Now, it's all about perception, and it's also about personal political experience. For example, I've been studying this phenomena for years. I have a lot of politically engage members of my family, none of us ended up as a member of any of these groups. But there are other people who come from equally politically active backgrounds where they have members of family who actually moved to the next stage. And I repeat, if you go and read interviews from these people, they all say more or less the same thing, that this is what happened. I was leading a perfectly politically motivated sort of life. I was very much into reading Marx, Engels, and all these people, and Che Guevara, and then something happens which tips them over. And then they find themselves in the sort of company which would advance this kind of beliefs through violence. And by talking to these people over the last few years, I realized that it's just a question of a second, From being non-violent to violent is just 3 seconds. You find yourself, some of them found themselves within the Greek context without actually realizing it, part of an operation. Because you've got to realize people are not, this is not a Hollywood movie. Some of them, they don't even know, they haven't received any training about shooting. And one of them says, if you are really dedicated, you're really determined, you learn along the way. So there's a human emotional intelligence factor here as well. These people do not go, as they used to do in the 70s, go to the Palestine and receive a 6-month training. You learn on the job, as it were. And your ideological conviction and your fanaticism, because let's not beat around the bush, these people are ideologically and politically fanatical, makes you to just make that little extra step. And then you find yourself, involved. And there's no going back.
Okay, good. I mean, you're right with the diagnosis. I mean, I will certainly not contest the fact that there are problems, discrimination, inequalities. I mean, I've said it. I mean, ghettoization and all of that. I think in all Western democratic societies, there are just so many ways before resorting to violence that you can explore, that I just don't follow the idea that these guys will use violence just out of one single frustration. There's much more at play there. And actually, if you look at many of their profiles, most of the people involved in the cells in Brussels and Paris, these guys had a job. I mean, they were working for public transportation, at the local level in various so they had a job. Some of them went, Abaoud, the leader of the cell, this guy, when he was young, he went to school in Uccle, like the fanciest neighborhood of Brussels. He blew it. I mean, he was expelled from the school because he did a lot of ridiculous thing. But he started with potentially a good chance of going to one of these very good schools. So we all know that the path towards violence is extremely complex, and again I agree that there is a huge problem there that needs to be addressed. But I remain convinced that we should address this problem not out of concern for terrorism and radicalization. We should address problems of inequalities for the very purpose of having more equal, fairer, better societies. And if we do that with the purpose of counterterrorism, I think we are doing it for the wrong reasons, and we are not going to do it right. And this is my most fundamental conviction, really.
Thank you. I think we have a couple of minutes just for a quick question.
Well, I certainly very much agree with what has just been said. There are two large countries which did face a major terrorist onslaught by groups of people who presented themselves as standing up to a blocked society. It was the Red Army fraction in Germany, it was the Red Brigades in Italy. Whether there was any outside manipulation, I don't know. They killed a lot of people and they got absolutely nowhere. They were a fanatical group of people. They weren't even sort of like a guerrilla warfare operation. They were self-promoted left-wing radicals, and they just poisoned the political atmosphere in both the countries. So I would say it's rather reassuring in 21st century Europe that there's virtually nothing. Possibly what you're referring to in Greece is the exception. There's virtually nothing of that kind, and even people on the far left and say the civil rights movement in the United States has existed for decades and decades. There have been Black Panthers and others, but I mean, and one could say right up till today, it's a partially blocked society. So resort to that. I mean, I think that's unless you really start analysing things globally and all different types of phenomena, because here we've been picking on Belgium, Greece, etc. That's just a spontaneous reflection. On the Caribbean, what about the rest of the Caribbean? Or I know in the half minute available, South America, I mean, is there something special about Trinidad? That's because there's a Muslim community, or there are obviously scatterings of Muslim all over the place? Is there something special about this particular?
Well,
it's an interesting
Jamaat,
microcosm.
Yeah, there's the Jamaat al-Muslimin, and this history, kind of vigorous history of Islamic radicalism in Trinidad. But then after the coup in 1990, the Jamaat kind of fragmented and splintered into different factions, and I think out of that collapse, you got these more kind of radicalized factions away from Abu Bakr. But yeah, nothing in Jamaica. I don't know of any Muslims who have gone, no. And of course, the state has had this very permissive stance in relation to these migrations, which is a very different kind of story from what you're talking about. State inaction, and so in that sense, you could say, well, the state can be complicit in terrorism when it doesn't act. People have just been walking out of Trinidad and going, and there's been a lot of agitation in 2013. Imams circulating ISIS propaganda and among their followers. Nothing's been done about that. And then you have this kind of infiltration of Salafi Islam, which has been going on since the late 90s. But yeah, it's very striking how the government has really done nothing about that issue. Yeah. Yeah. Not to my knowledge, no.
Thank you very much. This concludes our session. I would like to thank our speakers for their presentation. Thank you all. We'll convene here in 30 minutes.